And finally, I'll talk a little bit about one piece of research that I prepared while working at the Central Bank of Ireland, just to give you a better sense as to what do we do. And I hope that you will find it useful and interesting. Okay, so about myself. So originally I'm from Lithuania, and I started my career path by getting a bachelor's degree in economics, and then I realized I really liked banking and how banks create money and how we get credit. So I was super interested in that, and I thought I want to do more studies on that regard. And obviously the bank of the banks is the central bank, so that in a way motivated me to choose to study masters in central banking at the University of Glasgow. You probably won't find many people with this title for their master's degree, and I'm pretty sure they probably even removed it by now. But the idea was picking and choosing courses anyway, so the quality of the education was not affected by the super cool title. So during my master's degree, I researched for my dissertation about monetary policy reaction function, how the monetary policy instrument, which is the short-term interest rate, is set, and whether there's any asymmetry in how central banks react to developments in economic variables and price variables. And then I realized that probably master's degree was not enough to do what I wanted to do, as I started to be more and more interested in policy work and how monetary policy in particular is being done. And for that, I decided to study a PhD in economics, and I worked on US monetary policy and how it interacts with developments in financial markets. Now, as of course, not only education that matters and that got me where I am today, I also have some work experience at different fields, so to speak. So during my bachelor's, as I said, I love banking sector, and I actually worked at one of the commercial banks in Lithuania, and I particularly worked with consumer loans and mortgages. And that was in 2009, so actually it was a very interesting time to work because you could see the crisis was coming. So yeah, that was quite interesting, and I have to say I've learned a lot, and that was kind of like a background, a very good background for going forward. And actually, so how it led to this job, initially I did an internship with the same bank, and I would like probably just to emphasize, and I'll later on talk a little bit more about that internships is a very good way to get the foot in the door. So then, following my master's studies, I actually had a 2-year gap between master's and PhD degrees, and I worked at that time for Barclays, and I worked in the operational side of their investment banking branch, and I basically looked after large business loans, booked them in the system, so I learned, you know, all the background work that happens after talking over with customers, about their loan agreements, and how money were moving around from bank to firms, and from bank to the bank from other banks that also participated in the loan disbursement to firms. During my PhD years, I was also teaching. I was a tutor in economics, and mostly I taught the level 1 economics. I guess that kind of helped me to realize that academia may not be a career path for me. And I was pretty sure by then that what I want to do is to be an economist at the central bank. And I guess trying out different things in a way made me realize, you know, what I like, what I don't like. And that's also to encourage yourselves and in the future that, you know, the first job doesn't have to be the dream job. And any job could open up different ways forward. And so towards the end of my PhD, I was looking for a position at central banks, and I obviously considered Bank of England because I was studying at the UK, and I also applied to European Central Bank for their PhD internship program. And here it's also important to mention it's not only PhD internship programs what they do, but also for master degrees students. So I was very lucky to be offered a one-year contract as an intern there, and I worked at 2 different areas at the central bank, and they were pretty closely related. So one was working on prices and costs, and the other one on business cycle dynamics. And here I had a few projects with people there that we were working on. And more specifically, one of them was trying to develop the indicator for inflation cycle. And in the other part of the bank, I was working on consumption modeling and forecasting. So that also taught me a lot of things, and I had the chance to work with really good people, with economists who were doing their job for around 20 years by then. So you can just imagine how experienced these people are, and it's a very good experience for someone who's just starting to get a chance to work with people who have such a wealth of knowledge. And so after my internship, I was offered a research analyst position, and I stayed on for a bit till I found an economist position at the Central Bank of Ireland. So here I am. I'm currently at the Monetary Policy Division, and I've always been there since I started working here. And in June, it will be 3 years in total. So for some of you, it may look like it's a lot of experience so far, but since I worked with people who had 20 years experience, I still consider myself as a relative newbie in the field. So will not dwell more into details here because I'll talk about my work a little bit more in detail later on. Okay, so career paths to central banking. Now, I guess it's important to note that it's not necessarily only for economists who want to do monetary policy. Central banks have a wide variety of roles that you could think about. And they are, of course, related to economics, but there are also roles in statistics, financial stability, bank supervision, if you like, regulatory frameworks and work in regulation. So it's not only what I'm going to talk about today. So if you don't like what you hear, don't be disappointed just yet, and keep in mind that there are many different paths there. Now, for many research analyst or economist roles, the strong background is needed in at least one of the following fields of study: economics, finance, statistics, econometrics, and data analysis. So if you do like these things and all goes well, then you have tools already to think about the career in central banking. Now, as I said before, to begin this path, various alternatives are there for you. And at least for me, what proved to be useful and helpful and interesting and really rewarding is an internship. And many central banks, Bank of England and Central Bank of Ireland too, we offer internships and also graduate programs. And here you get the chance to work with us, with people like me, with my colleagues, and we teach you a little bit about what we do, and we get you to help us to do that too. So it's really good opportunities, I would say, if you would ever consider that. So that's it basically about me and the career paths to central banking. If you have any specific questions at the moment, you can ask me. If not, I will move on to a bit more specific part of the presentation that's pretty much about how monetary policies is being done in Euro area. Josue, if you also could monitor the chat, perhaps, because I'm not sure I can see if someone asked something in the chat. So I would appreciate if you see any questions coming up, just give me a shout, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's move on then. So the European Central Bank is basically the central bank of the 19 European Union countries that use the euro as their currency. And these together with European Central Bank, each country has its own national central bank as well. And these national central banks together with European Central Bank make up the European system of central banks. And according to European Union Treaty, the primary objective of the European system of central banks is to maintain price stability. Sounds fairly simple. In addition, whenever this price stability objective is achieved, we should also contribute to achieving some additional objectives that are not specified in the treaty, but they more or less sound as supporting general economic policies in the community. So that's quite a broad definition, but they should be aimed at without putting at risk the primary objective, which is the price stability. Now, how policy decisions are made in brief, they're based on the so-called two-pillar monetary policy strategy. That includes economic analysis and monetary analysis. So economic analysis, what it is about, it's focused on short to medium-term determinants of price developments. So any variable that can help you to evaluate the risks to price stability in the short run. Those typically are real economic activity indicators such as gross domestic product. That could be high frequency data coming from financial markets that can help you to establish their expectations. That also includes various price and cost indicators such as inflation itself, wage growth in the economy, the situation in labor markets, and so on. The big part of economic analysis is also the projections. So central banks care about the future. They make decisions based on how they think the economy will be doing in another year or two, because whatever they decide today will only have a full effect on real economy with a lag. And that lag is typically estimated to be around 1.5 or 2 years. So we always need good forecasts to know what decision we should be making. Now, in addition to economic analysis, there is a separate pillar used for cross-checking these risks to price stability. Excuse me. And monetary analysis focuses on long-term horizon, and it exploits the long-run link between money and prices. So this part, typically variables like monetary aggregates and credit growth are looked at and evaluated how that could affect inflation in the long term. Okay, so what is price stability? First of all, what is inflation? And I'm sure you all know, but I'm just going to say it anyways, just to be sure. So inflation rate is a rate at which a general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and consequently the purchasing power of currency is falling. If prices are falling, we have a deflation instead. And if prices are increasing at a high rate, such as 50% per month, then we call it a hyperinflation. So obviously neither deflation or hyperinflation is the definition of price stability. What we mean by price stability is a slow increase in the general price level over time. And this is what we want. This is what is good for the economy and ensures growth in terms of economic output, as well as wages for people and so on. So as the treaty establishes the primary objective as price stability, it doesn't say exactly what is the number of inflation rate that is suitable. So the ECB Governing Council has defined it itself, and it's defined as a year-on-year increase in the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, or HICP, for the euro area of below but close to 2% over the medium term. So now that sounds a little bit complicated, but let me try to explain what we mean by over the medium term and why it's important. It's practically impossible for any central bank to keep inflation at a given point all the time. Shocks happen, and shocks hit the economy, and sometimes it's out of your control, and sometimes it's only temporary. And you should not, as a policymaker, be reacting to these sudden but temporary changes in inflation. And therefore, looking through these short-term volatility helps you to make better policy decisions. So you focus on the medium term and you're a forward-looking central banker, you forecast, that this short-term volatility will fade out, and you make a decision based on that. So that's basically what it means over the medium term. Now, regarding the actual number, so many analysts, economists, and financial market participants say it's weirdly defined because it's below but close to 2%. So what is it? At the moment, and I'll come back to that a bit later, the ECB is reviewing its monetary policy strategy, and they're also reviewing this particular quantitative definition. So you can follow the news and see if that will be changed later this year or not. Okay, so how monetary policy works its way through real economy. Central banks do not control all the interest rates. They only control directly the interest rate that's also a policy rate. In the case of the European Central Bank, the policy rate at the moment is its deposit facility rate, and it's set as minus 0.5 currently. So once these official interest rates are changed, they also lead to changes in other interest rates, such as money market interest rates and longer term interest rates, such as bonds of the governments. And through these changes, they can affect the bank rates that then affect our rates on loans that we take from the bank and also the deposit rates. Changes in interest rates also affect asset prices, exchange rates, and through banking system, they affect the availability of credit and also the demand for credit, because if interest rates go lower, you might think of taking out the loan and buying something or investing somewhere. Changes in interest rates also affect expectations. So markets may expect a better future economic outlook because the monetary policy has become looser, interest rates fell, and they might start expecting higher inflation that would then feed into the pricing and wage decisions of firms and consumers, and that would eventually lead to higher inflation. So it's a very complex way how it operates, and not to mention the shocks outside control of central bank that basically we do not have power over, such as changes in global economy, and we just get the effects on our economy due to that. So all that, of course, may complicate how the transmission actually works in practice rather than in the chart. Okay, so how are decisions made? The Governing Council is the main decision-making body of ECB. What makes up the Governing Council? It's 6 members of the Executive Board, including the President Christine Lagarde and Vice President, and the governors of all the 19 national central banks in the Euro area countries. A Governing Council member meets before the pandemic. They would meet in Frankfurt and occasionally in some other Euro area country. They would review Euro area economic and monetary developments and discuss them, and then would take monetary policy decisions. These meetings happen every 6 weeks. The monetary policy decision is later explained at the press conference that the president and the assistant vice president chair. At this press conference, which you can watch every 6 weeks through the ECB's website, the press members, they can ask questions for the president and vice president. And sometimes they are actually quite interested if you would like to have a look one day. Okay, so this is the excerpt from account of Governing Council meeting on 7th of April in 2016. Now, all the Governing Council members do have voting rights, but in practice, voting hardly ever happens. So how do they agree on the decision? This table illustrates that. Once all the economic developments and monetary developments are discussed, the proposal of the policy decision is made by chief economist, and then again, every member of Governing Council can express their thoughts about the proposal. And usually it happens through mutual discussions, and they try to find the consensus, and most of the times it is successful, because to be honest, I don't remember the last time they actually ended up voting. So for instance, you can see from the sentences highlighted in red how the thinking goes along. For instance, broad support was expressed for the proposal. Concerns were raised about possible and desirable side effects that could arise from moving forward into negative territory. That refers to the negative interest rate that is set at the moment. A number of arguments were put forward, pointing to the benefits of a further cut. Overall, members broadly supported a further cut in the deposit facility rate. And then finally, President concluded that the large majority of voting members supported the proposed package, basically without voting. So that's how it works. Now, where do we stand here? So what is the role of the Central Bank of Ireland? The governor and deputy governor attend governing council meetings every 6 weeks for monetary policy reasons. At these meetings, the governor acts in its best interest of the euro area as a whole rather than of Ireland. So we have to take euro area perspective and do not base our decisions on a specific euro area country. You can imagine sometimes that becomes a bit difficult if countries experience very different economic environments. So the central bank provides the ECB, for instance, with data that is relevant to monetary policy, and that is taken care by Statistics Division. Irish economic forecasts as a component to the overall euro area forecast are provided by Irish Economic Analysis Division. A Monetary Policy Committee provides Irish views on policy proposals, and that is part of my division's work. And for instance, Irish view on policy implementation is provided by Monetary Operations Committee. So now we can move on to my team, which is Monetary Policy Division, and what do we do? So our work is broadly classified in two parts, the policy work and then the research work. So this slide shows you some examples. The list is not exhaustive, I may have forgotten something, of the policy work that is usually also research-based. So what do we do? First of all, obviously for governing council meetings that happen every 6 weeks, we have to prepare our governor. And so for that reason, we do monetary policy analysis, and we review economic developments and policy issues in preparation for those meetings with euro area focus. We attempt to predict what would be the important issues discussed at the governing council, and we tell our governor our views about the matters. And then he can ask us questions and so on. Now, senior staff of my division are part of Monetary Policy Committee, or MPC, which feeds views and analysis on various policy issues into the Governing Council. So myself and my other colleagues who are not the staff, senior staff, we sometimes help our members of the MPC to prepare for their meetings too. We go through the provided material, and we also advise them on specific matters that we are experts in, or our own opinions, or sometimes do a quick research on a specific question in preparation for that. In addition to this, we also collaborate with the rest of the Euro system or other national central banks and the European Central Bank. And that could be done through expert groups on specific topics. And for example, there was a few years ago an expert group on trying to examine the causes of low inflation in the euro area. And many national central banks and also European Central Bank staff members participated in that group. Another big thing that happened since last year is the ECB's monetary policy strategy review. The last strategy review was carried out in 2003. So last year in January 2020, just before the pandemic happened, the ECB announced that it will be reviewing its monetary policy strategy again. And myself and several of my colleagues, we participate in this review that has several work streams, for instance, on inflation measurement, globalization, unemployment, and monetary policy communications. So we are members in those groups and we help to carry out work in relation to strategy review. We also do other ad hoc policy briefings. So that could be on any topic that becomes relevant and our governor wants to know more about, such as climate change implications for monetary policy, or what are negative effects of negative policy rates. We also contribute to regular banks publications such as quarterly bulletin. We assist senior management with preparations of speeches and interviews, for example. Now, in terms of research, we also write research papers that could be either short, not very technical, designated for more general public, or could be more technical and longer papers. We also try to publish this research in academic journals. For instance, we investigate monetary policy effects on economic and financial variables. We look at the relationship between labor market conditions and wage growth. We also look at what determines firms' access to finance, what measures of liquidity are best, and, for example, how macroprudential policy affect monetary policy, impact on mortgage lending, and so on. These are just few examples of some work by myself and my colleagues at Monetary Policy Division, just to give a flavor of what we actually interested in. Okay, so I'm glad to take any questions up to this point. If there are no questions, I'll then just carry on. I hope people are still awake and not totally bored. Okay, so inflation obviously is one of the key variables for any central banker. And we are not an exception. We monitor inflation developments very closely. However, the pandemic made it far more difficult. And I'll talk now about why is that. So first of all, how do we measure inflation? So as I mentioned, we have a harmonized index of consumer prices that helps to calculate our inflation measure for euro area. And actually, the Bank of England is targeting inflation measured by a very similar, actually methodologically exactly the same index, because it's based on European Union regulations. So at least for now, what you learn about the HICP is also valid for consumer price index that calculates the inflation that Bank of England targets. So that could be still relevant for you as well, not only euro area. So what is HICP? It is a cost of goods and services price index that tracks prices of a very broad range of consumer goods and services between two periods in time. It's produced by statistical offices and not by central banks. Different goods and services are assigned weights based on the share in the total household expenditure on goods and services covered by the index. Now, these goods and services are regularly reviewed, and also their expenditure shares are regularly updated. And in the euro area context, it happens once per year. Now, these yes?
May I interrupt? Before you tell us more about the price index, there is a question by Luke Bell that I'm not sure you can tell us the truth.
Okay.
Luke, do you want to unmute yourself and ask Zivile directly?
Yeah, I was just curious, is there any differences of bargaining power amongst all the countries in the EU network, more powerful countries having more of a say and stuff?
That is a very interesting, very good question. So, as we mentioned before, the monetary policy decisions are based on aggregate euro area data. So it wouldn't be right to say that bigger countries have a bigger weight or bigger say in the monetary policy decision, because the decision is made for everyone. So my answer to your question would be no. I would not believe that for the actual decision making we have a bargaining power.
Why England sort of didn't enjoy it too much? Decisions being made not for them and stuff?
Okay, well, when it comes to monetary policy, actually the UK never really had the say because we have their own monetary policy. They were never part of Euro area, and the European Central Bank only concerns Euro area countries. So in this perspective, I'm not sure about all other political aspects of European Union and why, unfortunately, the UK has left us. But then it comes to monetary policy. They chose to have a pound, and they were having the pound, and that was totally agreed with the rest of the EU. And they have the Bank of England that carries out their monetary policy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, Josue?
I don't see any, but if anybody else wants to ask anything, or if not, I'm very happy to see how you measure inflation during a pandemic.
The boring part. Okay.
No, let's see.
Okay, so I was talking about expenditure shares. So basically, these expenditure shares on categories of goods and services are called weights. And for any given calendar year, so let's say for the year of 2020, when you calculate the index, these shares are fixed. So you do not change them from one month to the other. So current year T should be representative of the expenditure shares in the previous year T-1. So you would have some data, and then you would say, okay, I don't believe that from one year to another, consumer patterns, spending patterns change substantially. So I'm happy with this approximation. It's not ideal, but unfortunately, the data allows us only to do that. So you then derive the weights every December, January, and as of January every year, you have new weights in the HICP. So during normal times, that works quite okay and does not cause too many problems. However, the pandemic year was a different year in this respect. So before we go into why, I want just to show you how does the consumer basket actually looks like. So here we have on the left-hand side the two-digit level classification of the HICP, and you have 12 broad aggregates. And you can see health, transport, communication, food, alcoholic beverages, and so on. Now, these 12 sub-indices can be further disaggregated into what you can see on the right-hand side. Okay, so if you take food and non-alcoholic beverages, of course, one part of it is food. And then food can be further split into, let's say, bread and cereals. And that, again, has its own subcategories. So it's pretty detailed. And all the way up to the so-called 5-digit levels, which would be rice, fruit, countries are obliged to provide the shares, the expenditure shares or the weights, and the data to Eurostat, which is the statistical office for the Euro area. And it compiles the HICP. Now, what happens below that level? I'm going to show you in the next slide. So let's take as an example fruit. And all the pink boxes shows you the lower level classification that can differ from one country to another, depending on the data availabilities and the methodology that they then can apply. So if we take, let's say, the fruit, we can move to dried fruit and nuts, and then we choose dried fruit, and then we go into peanut, and you can see all the way to the lowest possible level, which would be very specific product. For instance, 600-gram jar of brand X of salted roasted peanuts, and so on. So just to give you an example, of how broad actually this basket is, and there are lots of things in there that neither you or I buy in a way. Okay, so it's meant to reflect average consumption patterns and not of all the consumers in all types of consumers. So it's an average consumer, average consumption patterns, and that's how you calculate inflation. So how did pandemic affected inflation measurement? In two ways. The first one is price collection. So in normal times, people in the statistical offices would actually go out into the stores to collect prices of specific products and services. They would also collect some of the prices online through emailing their contact lists, through doing surveys. During the pandemic, as all the lockdowns happened, naturally people were not able to go into stores and collect the prices. So a large share, I think in Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 50%, it could not be collected because you could not enter the store, the supermarket. Now, excuse me. In addition to that, some services, such as international flights, became unavailable. So there literally was no price to collect for such a service that did not exist at that time. And that meant that in these cases, statisticians had to impute these prices based on sometimes perhaps a little bit dubious assumptions. So that may have affected the reliability of the actual price index during the pandemic, because we were looking at the large portions of imputed prices that were not observed. So they had to be aware of that when taking policy decisions too. Now, while the HICP weights are fixed within a calendar year, during economic downturns or booms, this may lead to sudden but likely temporary changes in consumer spending patterns. So when recession happens, people might be shifting their consumption towards cheaper and maybe poorer quality goods, and that affects the spending shares. However, the HICP spending shares are fixed, and these changes are not reflected in inflation measure for that year. Now, during a normal standard recession, this may cause some mismeasurement issue, but not a big one. However, the pandemic caused a relatively big issue as some shares of, let's say, food increased substantially in our total spending. So basically, we stopped spending on so many things, and we saved a lot, or some of us saved a lot, and we also spend much more on food than we ever spent before. So the HICP figures were not reflecting such changes, and that introduced the bias in inflation measure. Okay, now regarding imputations, here I just gave you an example of how much in percentages of the total index was imputed in April 2020. So the top bar shows you the all item HICP. So over 30% of prices were imputed. They were not based on observed prices, which is the principle of the HICP, that all prices should be observed. Now, in terms of services, the sector that was more affected by the pandemic, it goes up all the way up to 40% and even over that. So we can imagine how substantial issue that was at the time. Currently, in the last 2 months, the share decreased to 13%. So even though we still have lockdowns, this problem somewhat decreased. Now, I'll just quickly go through several studies that showed, based on high frequency, debit and credit card spending data, how people change their consumption patterns. So all studies showed substantial falls in consumption overall. And then things like restaurants, transport, travel, recreational services, discretionary goods, spending on those fell substantially, while spending on pharmaceutical products, health-related services, groceries increased by a lot. And that was true for many countries. Okay, so I will not spend too much time on this, just go through the slides a bit more quickly. So one, I guess, of interest study is by Carvalho in the last bullet point on the slide. For Spain, they actually showed this. They calculated the market shares of various categories of goods and services and how that changed during the lockdown, which is denoted by the dashed line. So you can see that the top bar, the light blue color, the share of food in the market share, it increases substantially, whereas that of bars and restaurants declines. And the same happens for fashion, slightly for transportation and so on, hotels and lodging, which is dark green, and at the very, very bottom, it actually even disappears. So it visualized very clearly that there were massive changes not seen before, and that caused problems for statisticians and economists alike. So this chart shows similar information, although not maybe in such a nice manner, for Ireland in March and April last year. The teal bars denote the change in spending in April and in March, and the light green in April. So you can say you can see that also similar patterns can be observed here. Groceries and perishables at the bottom of the table increased in both months, while clothing, accommodation, transport, restaurant dining, all that decreased in both months and by large amounts. Now, what does that have to do with inflation, apart from the changes in expenditure share? Well, put together, the inflation rates of actual categories and the changing shares that are not taken into account would have an effect on inflation figures. So we started spending more on food, and actually you can see here that food in the 2 months of March and April compared to the 2 months before increased substantially. So the inflation measure does not take that into account, but now we spend more money on more expensive goods. That would bring up the inflation rate that we as consumers experience. Similarly for transport, that some of us stopped using altogether, the prices fell, but we didn't feel it because we didn't use transport anymore. So all that indicates that the actual HICP figures did not reflect what consumers were experiencing, or at least were reflecting it to a lesser extent than before. Here is some ECB research on the similar topic for the euro area. And you can see the chart again, that the big yellow part in the chart, which is food, increased substantially and remained higher than before, all the way through to August 2020. And the pink line, which is recreation services, declined and continued to be lower than before. Now, important note also is to remember that it's all relative shares too. So even if we did not change the amount of money we spend on specific good and service, if our total spending declined, the share of that good or service in the total spending would change regardless. Okay, so it's both absolute and relative perspectives needed. Also, ECB research produced the estimate as to what was the impact of these changes in consumption patterns on inflation rates. We calculated an experimental index that would have new weights every month based on what we actually purchase. And then we compared it with actual HICP inflation, and you can see this in the chart. So the red line denotes the gap between the two measures. So the new experimental index minus HICP inflation. And that tells you that the positive bars show you that the true inflation that consumers were experiencing approximated by this experimental index was higher than the HICP inflation by around 0.2 percentage points. And it remained quite persistently higher through the months of summer too. And that was mostly accounted for food and energy items, as shown by blue color in the bar. Okay, so basically we see evidence of consumers switching from lower than average inflation categories, such as fuel for transport, to higher than average inflation categories, such as food items. Okay, so implications for monetary policy are several. Basically, if you're not sure what is the true level of inflation rate, it's more difficult to tell how far away it's from your target level that you want inflation to be. And also it complicates forecasts of inflation. What was needed is a disaggregate view of inflation and the good knowledge of how much of it is imputed, and also the utilization of high frequency and alternative data sources to estimate the spending patterns of consumers in real time. Now, why this could be also a bigger problem in terms of monetary policy and the price measure being credible. If consumers don't think that the measure that we target is the measure that also reflects their experience well, they might simply decide that the price measure is not credible. And obviously, we do not want that. So the price index is considered, it should be representative of all the prices paid by consumers. and consumers should perceive changes in this index associated with their own welfare. So they should view it as an independent and reliable measure of prices. And the concern was at the moment at the pandemic that, if this continues, then this might cause some problems in this regard. And that brings me to the last part of the presentation. I know I'm taking a bit longer, I think, than expected, so I'm going to try to quickly wrap up here. Basically, I started this piece of research before the pandemic broke out, and I carried on during the pandemic, so it may be somewhat relevant, maybe not so much, but anyway, it's about how consumers see inflation. Information about consumer perceived inflation rates can be found in various consumer surveys, where we specifically asked, what do you think inflation was in the last 12 months, for instance. And a good example of such a survey is the consumer survey by European Commission that is carried out regularly every month, and it asks in qualitative and quantitative terms about price changes. So we ask consumers, do you think the prices increased, decreased, or didn't change? And then we also ask by how much. So that's a valuable source of information for central banks. The results show that in the euro area, households tend to perceive inflation higher than it actually is. And it's not unique to the euro area. The perceptions gap, however, decreased over time, and perceived and actual inflation tend to move quite closely together with correlation coefficient of 0.7. So this chart here shows the HICP inflation, which is the lowest line, the dark blue line, and the yellow line is the median perceived inflation by euro area consumers. So you can see that the gap is quite big between the two measures, but they do move quite closely together. The dashed gray lines show you the third and the first quartiles. So you can see that also among consumers there are those who think inflation is 8 percentage points higher, and also those that think it's only maybe 2 percentage points higher. Now, the specific question in this survey is about consumer prices, so how much they've gone up or down over the past 12 months. So it's not the question about the HICP per se. And the fact that they still move together is comforting for us in a way, because that shows that HICP captures the movements in inflation perceived by consumers. So this is what happened during the pandemic. So the lower line, the purple line, is HICP inflation, and the other two are the mean and median perceived inflation from the survey. You can see that perceived inflation went up, while actual inflation went down. And that relates to the previous slides where I said that the true inflation that consumers perceived and experienced was higher than the HICP because of these shifts in the relative share. So that's another evidence that probably this is what happened. That could explain why perceptions went up as opposed to down with actual inflation. Now, why this perception gap exists? There could be many reasons. It could be social and demographic characteristics of consumers, such as income levels, education level, your gender. Typically, we find that females perceive inflation as being higher and expect higher inflation. And people with higher education, they perceive inflation lower. Also, most frequently purchase items such as food and drinks, things you buy daily, they might have greater influence on your perceptions than items that you buy twice a year, for example. And consumers subconsciously might be giving a stronger weight for those things that they buy often. And if they experience higher prices through them, then it would be also reflected in their overall perceptions. Now, it's also possible that consumers consider goods and services that are not included in the official measure. And an example of this could be owner-occupier housing costs. And therefore, if house prices do influence consumer perceptions, that could explain part of the gap. HICP currently does include the rents that tenants are paying, but it does not include the costs that homeowners face if they live in their own house that, let's say, they took out a mortgage to buy for. Now, another reason could be psychological factors and general financial literacy of people. And consumers, for instance, may interpret outright deflation as decreasing inflation rates. We could notice better large price increases as opposed to when prices go down, or fail to adjust for quality changes. So important thing that I have not mentioned yet, in HICP, all the prices are adjusted for the quality. So if the product has a higher price but a better quality, and if the increase in the quality accounts for the whole increase in the price, then it's assumed that the price did not change. It's very likely that consumers don't do that in their mind when they are asked about the prices of consumers. Why do we care what consumers think? Well, first of all, the credibility of a price measure. If consumers don't believe it measures well what we experience, that is simply not good news for central banks. And also perceived inflation may influence consumers' economic and financial decisions. How much we want to spend and how much we want to save might very well depend on what we think is happening to prices in the economy. And also that could affect their future expectations about how inflation will develop in the next year or so. And that in turn could also impact their decisions to save and to spend. So that's why it's quite important that they would be perceiving inflation correctly. Now, my research, so what I did is just a relatively simple empirical analysis where I had two models and I regressed the perceived inflation rate of euro area consumers on various sub-indices of HICP. So the first model only looks at the big aggregates, the 12 indices that I showed you earlier, such as health, transport, communications. And the second model uses many more granular sub-indices, which would mostly be 4-digit level. So I'll show some of the specific examples a little bit later. And also the second model, in addition to HICP components, also includes the house price index inflation. So I try to see whether house price inflation affects consumer perceptions. Okay, and this is the results of the first model. So the model coefficients are estimated using elastic net. That basically means it shrinks the coefficients of those less important predictors, and the size of the coefficient, since it's standardized data in the model, can tell you the relevant role of each regressor in the equation. So you can see from the standardized coefficients column that housing, water, electricity has and other fuels, health, and restaurants and hotels have by far largest coefficients. That means they are most important predictors of perceived inflation. Now, once you rescale these coefficients, you can, in a way, not directly, but some sort of way, you can compare them to actual weights in HICP of the same indices. And you can see that restaurants and hotels that has a very large coefficient actually has relatively small weight in actual HICP, which is basically 9%. Housing, water, and electricity, that's slightly closer because large coefficient also meets relatively large weight, but that's again not true for health. So this is an indication that consumers, when we think about consumer prices, they might be assigning totally different weights to different items in their consumer basket, or if they even get the weight right, they might be overestimating or underestimating the actual inflation rates. Unfortunately, it's not possible really to tell what's happening. Probably it's a bit of both, to be honest. And this is the results of a model 2. So these are all the pre-selected items, and also the methods could potentially shrink the coefficients of unimportant predictors to 0. And actually, you can see here that transport and communication coefficients were shrunk to 0. So here I show only the ones that survived, okay? And you can see broad range of items from different sub-indices. So food, drinks, clothing, housing, transport, health, everything is covered. And in each of them, there are several that are more important than the rest, okay? And these are the selected regressants. And you can see under housing, water, etc., that residential property price inflation has been selected. So it is a significant predictor of consumer perceptions, but it's not in a way accounted by the HICP. So that's an interesting finding. Here I show you the top 10 predictors sorted by the size of their coefficient. The yellow bars simply indicate that these goods and services are considered as frequently purchased out-of-pocket goods. So you can see that in line with literature, it's true that the prices of things that we buy more frequently are quite important determinants of our perceived inflation. And the numbers at the end of the bars refer to actual HICP weights in percent. And you can see that there are some items that are very important have relatively small weight. And they are just as important as items like restaurants, cafes, and the like that has a higher weight. So again, indication that consumers might not have a precise consumption basket as statisticians would like in their mind. And the final point to make is I found that correlation between the perceived inflation and inflation rates of the index called information processing equipment that includes computers, laptops, and related equipment is negative. Now, one reason why could that be is that this is the index that experience rapid and sizable changes in quality in its goods, and the new versions of products phase out the old ones quite often, and basically it requires a lot of quality adjustment that also is relatively difficult for statisticians, not to mention consumers. So it's likely that consumers fail to take the quality adjustment into account, and they think that the actual prices are increasing while in fact they are decreasing. And that could explain the negative correlation. All right, so just to wrap up very quickly, several components in the HICP basket help explain consumers' view about inflation. We do appear to be assigning different weights to some components, or we may be underestimating or overestimating price changes of those components. House prices do seem to play a role in perceptions. So they kind of take owner-occupiers' housing costs into account, as HICP doesn't. And some of the evidence also points to the fact that consumers may fail to adjust for quality changes. So that is all from me, and thanks so much for listening, for your time. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me.
Thanks so much, Zivile. Like the part about perception was super interesting. If there are any questions, feel free to ask. I'll start with one. Do we observe the similar misperceptions on things like unemployment? Is that known? Do you know anything about the quality of perceptions on other variables?
It's a good question. So this particular survey, they do ask about unemployment, but we don't ask it in a quantitative way. So we typically ask, what do you think the employment situation is in the economy? You know, I haven't really checked precisely both theories, but I think when it comes to economic situation, consumers tend to perceive it relatively well. But again, you cannot really quantify it because they don't assign the precise number. What the employment rate do you think it is? But that could be interesting to let's say include perhaps in some surveys.
That's really cool. Thanks, Willie. There is a question by Lucas. Lucas, do you want to ask directly, or do you want me to ask it?
Okay, hi. You said before people used to travel from one country to another to measure inflation. So because of the pandemic was not possible, do you think that the pandemic actually helped transition to a more technological way to measure inflation?
Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, you asked that people were, as per your understanding, people were traveling to measure inflation, or did I get the question absolutely wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to international flights, for instance, or flights in general, as I said, even during normal times, some prices are collected at the field, so people do go to places to collect them, but other prices are still collected through surveys or contacting, for instance, contact persons or contacting airlines and asking directly them about their prices of their flights. So I would say in the case of flights, they probably were even normal times collected not face-to-face, but rather contacted someone who has the knowledge of prices. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I want to ask about the consistency of the imputation of unavailable prices and whether this could lead to. First, I want to ask if there is a consistency on central banks on how you guys impute the prices that you're unavailable to see. And second, whether that could explain, whether you think that could explain the gap between perceptions and actual prices observed.
Okay, thanks, Josue. Good questions. So for starters, so we ourselves, we do not impute the prices. That is done by statistical offices that act independently from central banks. Eurostat, which is the statistical office for Euro area, at the start of the pandemic, they released the methodological guidelines as to how prices could be computed for what types of situations. And some countries, or they would choose, how to follow them. So it wasn't like a strict rule that you have to do this way and that's the only way that is correct. But broad guidelines were provided, and the national statistical offices chose some of those guidelines and applied in the practice. Now, during the pandemic, it's likely that perhaps a large share of imputed prices that happened, let's say, in April and March, could have perhaps contributed to the perception gap. However, in normal times, the HICP is well known by the fact that it has no imputed prices, or very, very small share of it. So in any other year outside the pandemic, there would be very, very few prices that would be imputed, and that would only relate to those that need seasonal adjustment. So all other prices would be observed. So I don't think that would in any way affect the actual gap between perceptions and the inflation measure.
Okay, thanks, Zivile. If there are any other questions, feel free to ask now.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
What's like an interview process like to work in a central bank?
So different central banks can take different steps. It also depends on the level you're applied to. So I have tried several central banks myself. So from my experience, usually the first step is obviously making application, saying something about yourself, and perhaps providing a CV type information. And the next stage is usually some sort of internet-based test that could be, just to check your mathematical abilities, calculation under pressure skills, like these quick tests. And also I've seen in my experience some online tests where we provide you a piece of text and then a piece of text, and then they provide questions and you have to quickly read and answer a question, and so on and so forth. So that, let's say, would be another stage. Then after that, if you pass the test, usually follows the interview. And even before pandemic times, the first interview would typically be over the phone. Again, that of course could depend on the central bank or the position you apply to. And then you would be finally invited to the final interview. Where, for instance, in my experience, in my final interview, I had to present on a given topic, which I had time to prepare before, so the topic was given to me. At another position, it was just a panel interview where people from different parts of the bank were asking me questions about, what do you know about this, what do you know about that? So I would say, if, especially at the level like PhD level, if you apply for economist position, some selection processes could be tough, but I believe that if you start, after your master's degree or your bachelor's degree, of course, the position then perhaps wouldn't be as high, and that probably would also imply a bit less strict and tough selection process.
Really interesting. Thanks, Lucas, for the question. Are there any other questions? If
Could
not,
I just ask?
Oh, yeah, please.
I'm sorry. when it comes to the governor having to act on behalf of the whole Eurozone as opposed to just their country for their central bank, is there any way that that's ensured that they do that? Or is it just kind of a trust thing that they assume everyone will do that?
That's a very good question. Thanks for that. So indeed, sometimes situation, is not as straightforward because, as I mentioned, all the countries in a way are different, and some countries can have a lot of savers, and maybe a negative interest rate for them is not ideal. Other countries have more borrowers, so for them, very low interest rates are great. So of course, I would say, and even in the accounts of policy meetings that you can find on the ECB's website, you can read them through and you can see that, certain people raise specific questions, and not in a way like objections, but they say, look, this may not be a good idea because this has a negative impact on this and that. And then someone else would say, but on this regard, it would be very good. So we have discussions, and they, of course, we look at the country level data too, but we do not base their decisions on that. So they are aware that there's a very heterogeneous environment in some aspects. But the chief economists of the ECB and the executive board, we act on behalf of euro area. So I do believe that, there is enough assurance that through discussions of the policy proposals at those meetings and looking at the aggregate, the overall data, also with some focus, but much less focus on specific, especially larger countries, the decision eventually is made in terms of what we believe the euro area outlook is, and not for any specific country. So I would say, at least for me, I do believe that it works fairly well. I couldn't ever say that this decision only worked for like one country or two countries. So yeah, I hope that clarifies and helps to answer your question. Sorry if I'm not too detailed.
No, thank you. That helped. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Any other questions, guys? I think we had a question by Zach. Zach, do you want to ask right away? I'm going to ask for Zach because I can't hear Zach.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I couldn't hear either.
Yeah, Zach writes, do you think it's necessary to have an MSc PhD for central banking roles, or do you think it's possible to progress with just a bachelor's?
So with a bachelor's degree, I do think it's possible. Now, I think, I don't want to lie, but because I haven't checked lately the Bank of England website, but I do think we have a program for students right after the bachelor's degree. In the past, we even had a program that would finance your MSc while you work at the Bank of England, if I'm correct. So yeah, definitely it is possible, but it's probably more opportunities if you do have a master's degree. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Philip. By the way, the background got dark.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
It's not dark where I am.
That's okay. That's okay. Any other question, guys? Or if not, Zivile, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. It was so interesting to hear about these differences between perception. I think there's, people are just saying thanks. So thanks again.
All the best to everyone, and I hope maybe some of you will consider central banking in the future. You can always check Central Bank of Ireland website if you're looking for opportunities.
Okay, everyone, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you learned lots from